In 1838, in the heart of Virginia, a wealthy plantation owner conducted an experiment so morally reprehensible, so scientifically twisted, that it would send shockwaves through Southern society and become a dark footnote in the annals of American slavery. This is not just a story about the horrors of enslavement. This is about something far more sinister. A story about forced human breeding, pseudoscience, and the complete dehumanization of people treated as nothing more than livestock. The master's name was Thomas Sutpen, though some historians believe this was a pseudonym to protect his family's reputation. His plantation, Sutpen's 100, covered over 3,000 acres of prime Virginia tobacco land. He was wealthy, educated, and respected in his community, but behind the closed gates of his plantation, Thomas Sutpen was conducting an experiment that would horrify even his fellow slaveholders. Are you ready? Because this story will challenge everything you think you know about the depths of human cruelty. Thomas Sutpen arrived in Virginia in 1833 with a mysterious past and seemingly unlimited wealth. He purchased land in one of Virginia's most fertile regions, and within 5 years, he had established one of the largest plantations in the county. Unlike many plantation owners of his time, Sutpen showed an unusual interest in what we would now call selective breeding. He had been influenced by the emerging pseudoscientific theories of his era, theories that attempted to apply animal husbandry principles to human beings. These theories, rooted in what would later be called scientific racism, suggested that humans could be bred for specific traits just like horses or cattle. While many slave owners engaged in forced breeding to increase their enslaved population, Sutpen took this to an entirely different level. He kept meticulous records, journals that would later be discovered and would provide chilling evidence of his experiments. In these journals, he documented bloodlines, physical characteristics, and what he called breeding potential of every enslaved person on his plantation. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. Sutpen didn't just force enslaved people to reproduce. He developed a systematic program where he would arrange what he called marriages between enslaved men, partnerships that defied both the laws of nature and the social norms of even that brutal era. In the spring of 1838, Sutpen began implementing his most controversial program. He selected 12 enslaved men on his plantation and paired them into 6 couples. These men were forced into what Sutpen documented as conjugal unions. Now, you might be wondering, how is this even possible? What was Sutpen's actual goal? The answer is more disturbing than you might imagine. Sutpen believed that by forcing these unions, he could create a population of enslaved people who would be completely isolated from normal family structures, making them more psychologically dependent and easier to control. He theorized that children born from such disrupted social structures would be more docile and compliant. But there's more to this twisted story. Sutpen also selected certain enslaved women on his plantation and forced them into temporary unions with these same men, rotating them according to a schedule he maintained in his journals. His goal was to create offspring while simultaneously destroying traditional family bonds and creating maximum psychological confusion and dependence. The enslaved men were forced to live together in specially constructed cabins. They were given no choice in this arrangement. Refusal meant brutal punishment or sale to even harsher conditions in the Deep South, which every enslaved person feared. The psychological torture of this system was immense. These men were stripped of their dignity, their autonomy, and their ability to form natural relationships and families. They were treated as nothing more than biological machines in Sutpen's twisted experiment. Over the next 3 years, children were born from these forced arrangements, but the plantation records show something deeply disturbing. Sutpen kept detailed notes about each child, categorizing them by their parentage and the circumstances of their conception. He separated children from their mothers at increasingly young ages, sometimes as early as 18 months. He placed them in communal nurseries where they were raised by elderly enslaved women who were too old for field work. According to fragments of testimonies collected years later during the Civil War era, these children grew up in a state of profound confusion about their origins. They knew who their mothers were, but often had no clear understanding of their fathers or family structures. But here's where the story becomes even more disturbing. Rumors began to spread to neighboring plantations about Sutpen's experiments. Other slave owners were initially curious about his methods, but as word spread about the specific nature of his breeding program, even in that morally compromised society, people began to express horror and disgust. A traveling Methodist preacher visited Sutpen's hundred in 1008, and later wrote in his diary about the unnatural arrangements he witnessed. He described seeing men living in pairs in small cabins, and children who seemed melancholic and strange in their demeanor. The preacher tried to intervene, citing biblical principles, but Sutpen had him removed from the property. This incident, however, began to damage Sutpen's reputation in the surrounding community. By 1841, whispers about Sutpen's plantation had spread throughout Virginia's planter class. What's remarkable about this is that in an era where slavery itself was accepted and defended, Sutpen's particular practices were seen as crossing a moral line, even by the standards of that brutal system. Several factors contributed to the growing scandal. First, the very idea of forcing same-sex unions, even in the context of slavery, challenged the religious foundations that many Southerners used to justify slavery itself. They argued that slavery was a biblical institution, but Sutpen's practices contradicted biblical teachings about marriage and family. Second, other plantation owners feared that such experiments would inspire rebellion. Enslaved people who were subjected to such complete destruction of family and natural social structures might become desperate enough to revolt violently. Third, and perhaps most pragmatically, some slaveholders worried that Sutpen's methods, if widely adopted, could undermine the entire system. Slavery, they argued, required at least some semblance of normal social structures to function sustainably. Letters between plantation owners from this period reveal their concerns. One prominent Virginia planter wrote to his colleague, "Sutpen's methods are an abomination that will bring God's judgment upon us all. He treats human souls as though they were mere beasts, and not even beasts are subjected to such unnatural arrangements." Despite the horrific conditions, the enslaved people on Sutpen's plantation found ways to resist. Several of the men forced into these arrangements managed to maintain secret relationships with women on the plantation. They would meet in the darkness of night, in the tobacco barns or the woods beyond the fields, desperately trying to create some semblance of normal human connection. One documented case tells of a man named Samuel, who was one of Sutpen's experimental subjects. Samuel managed to maintain a relationship with a woman named Rachel, and she became pregnant with his child. When Sutpen discovered this, he flew into a rage, not because of the relationship itself, but because it violated his experimental protocols. As punishment, Sutpen sold Rachel to a plantation in Georgia, separating her from Samuel forever. She was 8 months pregnant at the time. This incident became a turning point. Samuel, who had until then complied with Sutpen's system out of fear, began to quietly organize resistance among the enslaved population. The resistance took subtle forms. Workers would deliberately slow their pace in the fields. Tools would mysteriously break. Crops would be damaged in ways that could plausibly be blamed on accidents or weather. But the most powerful form of resistance was something Sutpen couldn't control: the bonds of human connection that persisted despite his attempts to destroy them. The men and women on Sutpen's plantation created a hidden community. They passed messages, shared food, and supported each other emotionally. They sang spirituals that contained coded messages about resistance and hope. They told stories to the children that kept alive the memory of Africa and the dream of freedom. In 1842, something unprecedented happened. A coalition of local clergy and several prominent citizens, disturbed by the persistent rumors about Sutpen's 100, petitioned the Virginia General Assembly to investigate the plantation. This was extraordinary because interference in how a man managed his property, including enslaved people, was generally considered unacceptable in Southern society. But Sutpen's practices were seen as so extreme that they warranted exceptional action. The investigation was limited and ultimately unsuccessful in legal terms. Sutpen was a wealthy man with political connections, and the legal framework of the time provided him with almost absolute power over the people he enslaved. However, the investigation did bring public attention to his practices. Newspaper editors in Richmond and other Virginia cities began publishing veiled references to the unnatural experiments being conducted on certain plantations. One editorial from 1843 read, "There are practices occurring within our Commonwealth that bring shame upon our civilization. While we defend the institution of slavery as economically necessary and biblically sound, we cannot condone the complete abandonment of Christian morality in the treatment of servants. Some methods being employed go beyond discipline and management into the realm of moral monstrosity." Sutpen responded to this pressure not by changing his practices, but by becoming more secretive. He restricted access to his plantation and threatened his enslaved population with severe punishment if they spoke to outsiders. Between 1838 and 1845, approximately 37 children were born under Sutpen's experimental breeding program. The records are incomplete, but this number comes from property inventories and plantation ledgers that survived the Civil War. What happened to these children is one of the most tragic aspects of this story. Many of them were sold away from the plantation as they reached working age. Sutpen seemed to view them as products of his experiment rather than as permanent additions to his labor force. They were scattered across the South, their unusual origins unknown to their new owners. A few testimonies from formerly enslaved people, collected during the 1930s as part of the Federal Writers Project, may reference children from Sutpen's plantation. These testimonies speak of people who grew up with profound confusion about their origins and deep psychological scars from their early childhood experiences. One testimony from a man who believed he might have been born on Sutpen's 100 described growing up in a communal setting where nobody knew who belonged to who, and where children were raised like orphans, even though our mammas were right, they're working in the same fields. The psychological impact of Sutpen's experiment extended beyond those directly involved. It created trauma that rippled through generation, trauma rooted in the complete destruction of family structures and the reduction of human beings to experimental subjects. When the Civil War began in 1861, Sutpen's 100 was still operational, though Sutpen himself was elderly and his plantation was being managed by an overseer. Union troops occupied the area in 1864, and the enslaved people on Sutpen's plantation were among those freed by advancing Union forces. According to military records, the soldiers were disturbed by what they found. One Union officer wrote in his report about the peculiar arrangements on the plantation and the psychologically damaged state of many of the formerly enslaved people there. After the war, Sutpen's plantation was abandoned. The main house burned down in 1008, 167, under mysterious circumstances. Possibly arson committed by formerly enslaved people from the area. Thomas Sutpen himself died in 166, reportedly in poverty and isolation. His family disowned him, and his name was removed from many official family records. The story of Thomas Sutpen and his forced marriages represents one of the darkest chapters in the history of American slavery, and that's saying something in a system already defined by unimaginable cruelty. What makes this story particularly disturbing is that it reveals how slavery wasn't just about labor exploitation. It was about the complete dehumanization of people, treating human beings as experimental subjects, as biological machines, as property to be manipulated for any purpose the owner desired. Sutpen's experiment was condemned even by other slaveholders, not because they suddenly developed moral consciences, but because his methods were so extreme that they threatened the delicate psychological and social framework that kept the entire system functioning. The people who suffered under Sutpen's system showed remarkable resilience. Despite his attempts to destroy their humanity, they maintained their connections, their hope, and their resistance. They are the true heroes of this story. Today, very few people know about Thomas Sutpen or his plantation. The story has been largely forgotten or deliberately obscured. But it deserves to be remembered, not to sensationalize the past, but to understand the full depth of slavery's cruelty and the incredible strength of those who survived it. The descendants of those enslaved people on Sutpen's 100 are living today, though most probably don't know this dark chapter of their family history. Their ancestors endured the unendurable and survived the unsurvivable.